Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. There are basic understandings in Sufism that in order to understand the nature of Sufism and the direction that Sufism is trying to push humanity, you have to understand. And it begins with the way La ilaha illallah is interpreted. The usual interpretation that you hear is there is no God but Allah. In Sufism, it's interpreted, if you were to say it in English, only God exists and I do not exist. Now, there is quite a difference between the two ways of interpreting that. Allah, being the only God, sets up a separation between man and God, I and thou. I do not exist, only God exists, takes away the duality of that inference. Since we're not here in reality, there is no duality. Reality doesn't have duality. Bawa's first book was called The Divine Luminous Wisdom That Dispels the Darkness, Man, God, God, Man. This came out shortly after Bawa came to the United States in about 1972. And from the beginning, he put forth that what he was trying to explain to us and the message that he was bringing to us is the understanding of the relationship between man and God, and how God is the mystery within man, and man is the mystery within God. Now, the basic terms in Sufism, or some of the basic terms within Sufism, are Shariat, Tariqat, Hakikat, Marifat, and Sufiyat. And these are an ascending scale of interaction with illusion and the disappearance of illusion from our being as we move further along the scale. So in Shariat, we have rules and regulations for our interaction with the elemental world, for our interaction with that which we sense, for that which we see, for that which we touch, for that which we eat. Tariqat is the beginning of the path to find reality. Hakikat is beginning to unencumber the self of attachment to this physical world. Marifat is the residue that exists after the attachment to the physical world has been mostly cut, severed, where what's left is what's real. Sufiyat is this final merging that occurs with Allah, through Allah, by way of Allah. In other words, Allah accepts you and brings you to Him. Two other technical terms are fana and baka, and we should be aware of them because if you're reading, you'll run into them. And fana is something like the definition of marifat. It's when you have detached yourself from the illusory world and you are left with what remains within you after that happens. Marifat takes you to the point, Sufiyat takes you to the point where Allah accepts you and brings you close to Him and incorporates you within Him. So the point to be understood is that this is Allah's doing. It's not our doing. We prepare ourselves for Allah's doing, but it is Allah that is the doer. And in each state, it is Allah that is the doer. Now, I've set forth in a few words an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of understanding about our relationship with our Creator and our relationship with this illusory world. And whatever stage that we are at, we have to realize that there are further stages ahead of us, and that there's more to be done, more to be accomplished, and this path doesn't end. What happens in the world is that men get a little bit of understanding and they begin to become arrogant with that little bit of understanding, and then they solidify that understanding as if it's an end in itself. The whole point of the truth of Allah is there is no end to this journey. As long as we are within this body, and as long as marifat, sufiyat, haven't occurred, there is no end to this journey. And if the journey were to end, we would be without personality. We would be without speech. We would be in a state of silence. We would be in a state where we no longer have to push and pull the world because our attachments to it have lessened to the point of non-involvement, and just as importantly, we've lost the need for involvement. And this state of losing the need for involvement is a very high, elevated state. My sheikh, my teacher, used to say, and he said it often, he said, when I am here, God is not. And when God is here, I am not. And this is a core understanding within Sufism. In the Turkish language, there's a word called sohbet. And sohbet, literally translated, means conversation. But the actual meaning of the word is to speak without thinking. In other words, to have a conversation without self-involvement, to have a conversation without self-motive, to become a flow that occurs through a connection to reality, so that reality comes through you without the interference of you, without the interference of self. And one of the amazing things about sohbet is, if you're listening to a flow of information that comes without self-motive, that comes through somebody as opposed to from somebody, you are capable of getting involved with it if you can let yourself go. So there may be one voice, but it represents everybody at the same time, if everybody is capable of letting themselves go. So we are on this path of denial of the self. As Rumi says, you have to unself yourself. You have to be rid of the self. And when that self, which is superimposed upon us, is gone, then there are different stages of understanding and different stages of entering reality that become available to us. But we can't maintain our own personality. We can't maintain our own attachments. We can't maintain, and these are the big ones, desire and our needs, and also move forward on the ladder of consciousness, move forward into understanding reality. And it's quite simple to understand the difference. There is the animal and there is the transcendent. And the animal has animal qualities. And the animal qualities, which are called the animal soul or the nafs amara in the Arabic, are the lower end of the spectrum of consciousness. And if we are to move to the higher end of the spectrum of consciousness, we have to give up our attachment to the lower part of the spectrum of consciousness. You can't be in low consciousness and high consciousness at the same time. You can't expect the benefits or the seeming benefits of the animal consciousness and simultaneously move into transcendent consciousness. The joys of the animal are the joys of lust, the lust of power, the lust of accumulating things, the lust of sex, the lust of fame, all of the things that the world that hasn't transcended considers important. If you want to get a grip on what that's about and what it's like, read People magazine. Take a look at what the world considers important. And what the world considers important is fame, power, wealth, and beauty, and the ability to manipulate the elemental forces within the world. If you want to take the path towards finding out the truth about who you are and taking the path of finding out your actual connection to reality, your actual connection to God, certain things have to begin to happen. Now, you should also understand that one of the names of God is Hak, and Hak means reality. Now, either you step into reality or you remain in illusion. Either you try to cross over illusion or you accept this illusory world as your lifestyle, as who you are, and as where you are. Now, what happens in much of religion, depending on how transcendent the people who are purveying the religion are, the religion will stop at a certain level and consider that level as far as you need to go. It also takes on some very interesting kinds of manifestations. For instance, in order to become someone who is elevated within the religion, you have to go to school, you have to get degrees, you have to get titles, you have to get an immense amount of learning before you are accepted as someone who can preach or who can put forward the truth. Let's contrast that with the life of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. I'm sure you are all aware that the prophet was unlettered. The prophet was without the ability to read. And it is evident, or it should be evident, that Allah chose someone who couldn't read and write in order to bring the message to. This is to show us that it is not about the amount of learning that we have in this world that gives us an understanding of truth. What gives us an understanding of truth is what our essence is and what our essence has become and can become. The prophet's essence was such that he was pure. He was without all of the attachments to the elemental world. And this purity gave him the ability to transmit the truth that was given to him directly. There is a story about the prophet that when he was a child, angels came and opened his chest and cleansed his heart. And all that which was impure within him was taken away. May it come to pass that all of our hearts are cleansed, and that all that is impure within each and every one of us is cleansed away. 10 or 12 or maybe more years ago, I was in Miami, and there is a Hispanic Sufi group down there that I've become close to. And I was giving a talk to them. And after I was finished, a young boy who was 10 years old came up to me and gave me a picture. And the picture was of a heart. And there was an angel floating next to the heart, and he had a pencil in his hand. And the pencil had an eraser on the end of it. And there was a little picture of a gun inside the heart, and the angel was erasing the gun. And the boy who did this was 10 years old. And I have the picture in my office somewhere. One day maybe I'll be able to show it to you, or maybe I'll use it as a cover of a book. But it was an astonishing understanding. We all have this part of us that is inclined towards participating in the world, and participating in the world in a way that a gun participates in the world. I mean, and think how a gun participates in the world. It basically points and says, do what I want or it's going to go off. And many of us participate in the world that way. And religions get to the point where they participate in the world in that way. Now, we watch all this, and we have to make an active choice for ourselves. Are we going to participate in the world in the way a gun participates in the world? Or are we going to find a transcendent path wherein we cleanse ourselves purposefully, and no matter what our circumstances surrounding us are, we choose to go the way of peace. We choose to go the way of love. We choose to go the way of contentment, and we choose to go the way of non-violence, wherein we don't need to impose our will, where we don't need to actually take positions and have opinions. Are we capable of being quiet? Are we capable of being still? Now, the interesting thing is, and this has to be understood, and it has to be understood very subtly. When the prophet was alive, there came instances wherein he had to go to war, where he had to defend himself and his people, where the amount of duress that his community was being put under needed some resolution, where he had to protect his own community. And God did not give him permission to fight for a very, very long time. And finally, God gave him permission to fight, but with immense restrictions on what could go on. And there is a story about Ali that exemplifies this. He was in hand-to-hand combat, and he was about to kill his opponent when his opponent spit on him. And as soon as that happened, Ali felt anger at his opponent arise within him. And this anger had gone beyond the need for self-defense. It became very personal. And Ali understood that as soon as it became personal, he could not act on it, and he dropped his sword. The opponent saw this, was overwhelmed by the action, understood the underlying nature of what had just occurred, and became a believer. We need to understand that kind of relationship with humanity. We need to understand that kind of transcendent behavior, and we have to become involved in transcendent behavior. In living day to day with the Sheikh, we would see that kind of transcendent behavior in action. We would see that kind of behavior on a constant basis. We saw the fact that the Sheikh didn't need anything. Anything that came into his hands immediately went out of his hands. Whenever anyone came to speak to him, we saw the Sheikh give that person his undivided attention. It's almost as if he melted into that person and allowed that person to overtake him so that his empathy was complete with that person, and he could understand the situation that that person was going through and then give them advice as to their situation. Now, of course, every question couldn't be answered, and everybody couldn't be talked to. There was one situation where someone came to him and said, "I want you to tell me about myself." And the Sheikh looked at him and he said, "I could do that. But if I did, I would have to spend the rest of my life defending myself from you." Which gives you some insight into the fact that there are snakes out there. And you have to be careful with snakes. He ended the sentence, by the way, saying, "But that doesn't make me any better than you." Which means there is a level of equality amongst each of us, for each of us, with each of us, that we have to understand if we're going to truly be able to move forward towards this transcendent place where we are not attached to the world. As long as we see differences between ourselves and others, transcendence can't occur, because for unity to occur, there can't be separations. Unity doesn't mean that other people agree with me or I agree with other people. Unity means that I don't have opinions, and that as opposed to my individuality, there is an overriding unity amongst all of us. Something like there's one great soul that's split up into many pieces and eventually comes back to the unity with the Creator. We have to develop an attitude that's like that towards our existence. We have to develop an attitude that doesn't see differences. Right now, in America, for instance, there's something called identity politics, which means you take your personal identity, whether it be race or religion or whatever, and you identify with that, and all of your effort is to make that better, to make that greater, to bring about a resolution as to that part of existence. Well, as long as we identify with a certain sect or a certain race or a certain color or a certain religion, and we identify with that to the exclusion of others, we are separating ourselves from God's creation. We are separating ourselves from humanity. We are identifying ourselves in such a way as I am different than you. That kind of thinking has a lot of impact in the world right now. That kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that separates countries and brings about wars. That kind of thinking goes on, such as during World War II, when Hitler proclaimed that the Aryan race had the right to rule the world because they were the best of all people. That kind of thinking creeps into humanity on a steady basis, over and over and over. I mean, I find it interesting that in Myanmar, this Buddhist country, where the teachings of the peaceful Buddha are supposed to be entrenched, there's so much difficulty with people that are other than Buddhists. It's just a bizarre way that things have happened, and a bizarre understanding of the teachings of this incredibly peace-oriented teacher. In the end, it always comes down to ourselves. In the end, it always comes down to the decisions that we make. We are not going to be held responsible for the decisions that other people make. We are only going to be held responsible for the decisions that we make. And what is the point of these decisions? These decisions will either bring us on the path of transcendence and bring us closer to a final rapture with our Creator, or will bring us in the other direction towards becoming more and more animal, more and more self-motivated, more and more self-possessed, more and more only interested in our own satisfaction, our own needs, our own desires. And that's the pendulum that's constantly swinging back and forth. The attachment to our pleasure, or the transcendence into the great pleasure. And the great pleasure is the unity with our Creator. Imagine if you were able to understand Rahman and Rahim, mercy and compassion, at their depth. Imagine if that flowed through your being. And imagine that compared to the riches and the wonders of this elemental world. Is there anything in the elemental world that can touch the non-elemental treasures that exists as God's qualities? Is there anything in this elemental world that can touch the understanding of the transcendent qualities of Allah? And we somewhere, somehow, have to finally come to the conclusion and understand that the transcendent names, the transcendent qualities of our Creator are what is going to fulfill our being, is what is going to make us real, is what is going to take us from all of the difficulties that we encounter in this life. Or else we can stay with the elemental things, and all of the things that the elements are subject to, we will be subject to. And what is that? Life and death. A constant struggle between things coming into creation and going out of creation. Things dissipating, things disappearing, things falling apart. That's the nature of this world. So we have to make this choice. Are we going to rely on the elemental for our life, or are we going to rely on the transcendent, non-elemental qualities of our Creator for our salvation? And really, this is the choice that we make. We have to make the choice to believe in that which we can't see with our eyes. We have to make the choice to believe in that which is beyond the senses. We have to make the choice to believe in the truth of the light, the truth of the nur, the truth of that which transcends this elemental world. And that has to be our focus and our intention and our prayer. And in doing that, we will find the truth of our own being and find the truth of all being, and will begin to take the path that goes towards our Creator. This is the choice that we're given. This is the free will that we're given. We'll either choose the world and make all of these minor choices, or we'll make that big choice that Allah is our Savior, that Allah is who we turn to, that Allah is who we rely on, and that Allah will bring us to Him, and we will become entwined with His qualities and released from the chains of this illusory world that only bring death and destruction. May it come to pass that each of us truly understands this, and we climb the ladder of transcendence towards our Creator, and we get to know His haq, His truth, His reality, and that becomes our truth and our reality. May it be so for each of us. Ameen, Ameen, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.